Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Mr. Saucedo's YouTube videos. Today we're going to be talking about the different types of proteins that you can find inside of a cell membrane. So just to remind you, right, these little kind of, I guess they're brown, little circle things with the little tails on them, those are phospholipids. And so this would be like a protein that is extending through the membrane, through the cell membrane. And so there are two main types of protein channels. And so we're going to talk about two of them today, and then we'll talk about subcategories in a second. But the first ones are called ion channels. Ion channels are proteins that allow specific ions to passively move through the cell membrane. So when we say passively, what we mean is that no energy needs to be utilized in order for this to work. So we're talking about things like potassium ions or sodium ions or chloride ions. You can kind of think of these as like the nuclear pores, where they're just kind of like an opening that will allow things in or out. And so we've got, a ton of different ions that your cells need and can use that could be ion channels that would allow them in or out of your cells. So there are certain types of ion channels. The first one is called an ungated ion channel. Ungated ion channels are always going to be open. So there's no closing them. They are literally just kind of like a hole. And normally these holes have like specific shapes to them so that only particular types of substances are able to get through. You can kind of think of it like, I don't know, like one of those games when you're like a kid and you have to like match the shapes and put them in these little holes or little openings, and only, the certain hole with like a particular type of opening is going to allow you to put that little shape through it. That's kind of what the ungated ion channels are like. So you can picture like, oh, there's a star-shaped, reactant, or there's a star-shaped ion or something, right? That's going to have a little protein ion channel. If it's ungated, it's just going to allow, it's going to have a star-shaped hole, and only star-shaped things are going to be allowed through. And so that's kind of how an ungated ion channel works. Voltage-gated ion channels are super cool. It's how our nerve cells work. But they're channels that will open or close in response to electrical signals. So here is an example of that. So you can see here, we have like, you can see the positive charge on the outside, right? And you can see the negative charge on the inside. But what's happening is when the electrical signal stimulates the ion channel to open, you can see them opening from left to right, right? So you can see that all of these little blue um, protein channels are opening, and all the little yellow ones are opening uh, in sequence as the signal gets transferred through. And so all it takes is an initial voltage. So that can be any electrical impulse, and then it will propagate and move continually through the channel until it reaches all the way to the end of the cell membrane. And then in our nerves, at least, right? There is a release of some chemicals that would stimulate the next nerve in the series to continue that signal and carry it down to another part of the body. So voltage gated channels are super cool. Again, the most common ones that we think of are obviously going to be nerve cell related ones, but we'll talk about a plant that has some voltage gated ion channels in a little bit. Mechanically gated channels, those open or close in response to pressure. So again, I like to think of ones that you would have probably heard of before, because ones that are like on our skin or in our organs or something, those are probably a little bit more common than us talking about like some sort of like weird example. So mechanically gated ion channels, they will open and close in response to pressure. So that's the reason why if you even barely touch a hair on your arm, you pick that up. It's because there is a mechanically gated ion channel response when you touch your hair. It's a pressure sensor, basically. That's what a hair is. It's a pressure sensor. Mechanically gated ion channels also help us hear. There are little hairs in our ear that are picking up pressure, and that's helping us hear and helping us keep um, helps us distinguish between tones and stuff. Um, and the last type of ion channel is a temperature gated ion channel. And it's almost exactly the same as voltage, but instead of electrical impulse, we're talking about temperature. So if the temperature hits a certain amount, that's going to open or close the channel in response to, that heat or lack of heat. So I was talking about plants that have voltage gated and mechanically gated ion channels. And a good example of that would be like a Venus flytrap. So Venus flytraps have these little tiny hairs on the inside of their, I'm going to call it a mouth. I don't know what else you'd call it, but it looks like a mouth. So I'm going to call it a mouth. And so it has these tiny little hairs. And only after the hair has been stimulated, like touched, a certain number of times is it going to trigger a closing response. Because, and I guess this kind of makes sense to us too, right? Like every time, like we are constantly under pressure. Right now, there is one atmosphere of pressure pushing down on us. And we're not in constant, like, we're not constantly thinking, oh, yeah, like I can feel this pressure. That would be ridiculous. Same thing for these little Venus flytraps. If every single time something touched that hair, it closed, it would waste energy that way. Because, like, it's a plant. What if a leaf fell and grazed it? It would close. Great. Now it's got to open up and it didn't even get a meal. So, um, it has a mechanically gated ion channel response only after the hair has been uh, hit a certain number of times in a short succession is it going to close. And then how does it close? Well, there you go. You can see it closing. The closing response is caused by an electrical voltage gate. So voltage gate for an ion channel that is going to cause that contraction and that closing. Um, I just like this picture because, again, when your hairs stand up or something, good old spidey sense. But that could be a response to pressure. It could be a response to temperature. Uh, Again, we have thousands of sensors all over the place. So sometimes it's hard to figure out, like, okay, which sensors, being stimulated at this time. But you get the idea, right? If it was too cold or something, oh, your hairs would stand up. That would be a temperature response. Or it could be that something touched your arm hair and then all of a sudden your arm hairs raise up. That would be like more of a pressure response or a mechanical response. Okay, what is the other type? So those were ion channels. Then we have ion pumps. So what's the big difference? The difference is that these are active processes. So the previous one that we just talked about, those are passive, which also explains why you could basically hook up a dead frog to an electrode and shock its leg, and it will still, you know, contract or move. That's because it doesn't require any energy. I guess in a way, the electrical impulse is kind of energy, but you get the idea. It's that the ion channels will open or close in response to any electrical stimulus. It doesn't have to be generated by us. Um, Whereas ion pumps, on the other hand, those open or close based on an active response, which means that requires ATP, it requires energy. And so we have ATP utilizing channels, and they convert ATP into potential energy. And so a good example of that is sodium potassium ATPase. And so remember, we talked about things that end in ase. That means that this is an enzyme, right? And so sodium potassium ATPase, it's kind of giving you a clue as to what it does. But here we go. Here's a, kind of a good visualization. 3 sodium, okay, can attach to this little ion pump. ATP is supposed to be this little E thing, and it will let 3 sodium go outside of the cell. And then that will allow 2 potassium to go in, and then the little ATP will, come off. And now we have potassium. So this is a way of pumping actively sodium outside of your cells and getting potassium inside of your cells. So it's kind of like an exchange. We are losing sodium, but we are gaining potassium as a result. And again, it costs us energy to do that. We also have ATP producing channels. They manufacture ATP. And so I know it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Obviously, it costs us ATP in order to make ATP. But there has to be a net gain of ATP in order for it to be advantageous to us. So ATP synthase is the protein structure that turns like a turbine. And this is actually kind of what it looks like, which I thought was super, super cool because you can kind of see it in motion. You can see the molecules going in and out. But it produces ATP, and it is an ion pump. And it works off of the movement of hydrogen ions. And again, super cool that this is like one of the ways that we make energy, right? All right. Symporters. So symporters are channels that allow the movement of multiple types of ions simultaneously. And so there really aren't any good examples that were super simple of symporters, but here's one. We've got sodium, potassium, chlorine cotransportase. Again, it allows all three of these to move through, and it does cost energy, though, in order to do that. And you might think, hey, why isn't this ATP utilizing one an example? Because they're not going at the same time. So sodium is leaving and then potassium is entering. They're not going at the exact same time. And you can kind of see they kind of do it like it's opening and closing. And that's kind of the reason why. It's because this channel has to actually open in order to allow the sodium to exit and to allow the potassium to go inside. Symporters can have multiple things going in and out simultaneously at the same time. And so again, here is a good example of how ATP synthase kind of works. If it plays, there we go. So you can see we have a movement of hydrogen, It's all going over here. And then it goes straight through ATP synthase. And as these hydrogens are going through, like a water wheel, it starts to manufacture ATP. And so ATP synthase is what manufactures the ATP in the mitochondria during the electron transport chain. So we're talking about in that the kind of cristae of the mitochondria, that's where this particular protein is found, ATP synthase. All right, and that's it. So if you have any questions, let me know.